Lyde Brackman always believed that his gift was not a curse, but a kind of vocation. As a young boy, his visions were rare and clear. He could warn loved ones of accidents or tragedies. At the age of 12, he saved his sister from an accident by telling her not to get on a bus that would overturn on the highway that day. After this event, he began to be considered a hero. Lyde became convinced that his power was to help, to be able to prevent death. However, the older he got, the darker his visions became. He stopped seeing simple accidents. Scenes of brutal deaths began to replay in his mind, frightening images of a future in which no one could escape their fate. Instead of gratitude, people began to shun him. Friends, family, even those he had saved, they all grew distant. People feared him, whispered behind his back, and soon Lyde was an outcast in his own town. Translated with dpel.com, free version. Lyde Brackman sat in his cluttered office with his head bent over an old file folder. The dim light of the lamp cast long shadows on the walls, making it feel closed in, as if time had frozen. The smell of dust and old books lingered in the air, punctuated by the notes of ink that had long since faded on the paper. Outside the window, there was a fine rain, as if nature itself was crying with him, gradually plunging him into a state of anxiety. His thoughts were filled with the deafening despair that had become his constant companion. Over the past few years, he had withdrawn into himself, trying to avoid any predictions. But fate had other plans. The shadows of his past were not going to leave him alone. The ringing of the doorbell was unexpected, almost out of place. Lyde flinched sharply, as if he'd been plucked from a nightmare. "Lyde," said a familiar voice. Elena Hartwell stood on the doorstep, a journalist he'd crossed paths with years ago when she'd written an article about his talent. Now she was more than an observer. Her eyes were filled with anxiety, an anxiety so familiar to him. "You're here for a prediction?" he muttered with muffled sarcasm, rubbing his temples. Helena nodded and, without waiting for an invitation, sat down across from him. Her fingers slid nervously along the edges of the sheet of paper she held in her hands. "Lyde, this is important," she said, trying not to show the tremor in her voice. "I heard that someone started killing people based on your predictions. Everything matches, dates, circumstances, even things you've seen before." Lyde froze. He couldn't immediately find the words. His thoughts were racing erratically, as if he was trying to grasp something important, but every time it slipped away. "What are you talking about, Elena?" He stood up abruptly, not believing his ears. "My predictions were always accurate, but they didn't involve murder." "Then how do you explain this?" She threw the newspapers on the table. The headlines were rife with tragedy: young man murdered, death under mysterious circumstances, victim of violent death predicted. All of these articles mentioned one name, Lyde Brackman. All of the victims had actually consulted him in the weeks before their deaths. "That's impossible," he muttered, sinking into his anxiety. His heart thudded in his chest, foreboding trouble. "It is possible, Lyde," Elena replied sharply. "And they won't stop. Whoever's behind this is clearly using your predictions to control death. Do you want me to start predicting again?" Lyde smirked bitterly. "You realize how this is going to end, don't you?" Translated with dpel.com, free version. Elena was silent for a moment, looking at Lyde as if seeing him for the first time. She knew his story, knew how his gift had turned into a curse, how he had retreated into the shadows after one of his predicted deaths had become unbearable, the death of the very sister he had once saved. He knew then that he could not prevent fate. The prediction he had given his sister when she was young had not spared her death, only postponed it. 20 years later, she died on the very spot where Lyde had seen her doom. The death that overtook her came in the form of an accidental accident. Lyde realized that his visions were not an opportunity to save, but an inevitability no matter what he did. And now, years later, someone was trying to play with that inevitability, playing with him as well. "We don't have much time, Lyde," Elena interrupted his thoughts. "The cultists who call themselves the Forerunners are using you as their prophet. You need to stop it, or they will get to those still alive." Her words settled with a heavy weight. Lyde had always known that his gift was a chain binding him to inevitability. Now that chain had become a noose. The decision came suddenly, like a breath of cold air in a musty room. "Okay," he said quietly, pulling an old, worn key out of his pocket. "We'll find them. But it won't change anything. Fate will still catch up with them, just like it caught up with me." Elena tried to object, but he was already up, packing. They moved on their way through the night streets. The city seemed alive, as if the shadows on the walls were following them, whispering of things to come. Lyde felt they were moving towards something huge that could not be stopped. Each step echoed in his soul, as if foreshadowing the imminent. When they reached the old building that had once been part of the underground system, Lyde felt a cold touch of fear. They entered the tunnels. Thudding footsteps and rustles wrapped around the walls, causing alarm. It was as if each corridor was trying to draw them in, to trap them. The shadows seemed alive, as if they were watching them, stalking them like prey. A sense of impending disaster grew inside Lyde. The tunnels led to the cultists, but what they would find at the site, he didn't know. "It's here," Elena whispered as they entered a huge empty room lit by a faint fire. In the center of the room stood men in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. "He has come," one of them hissed. "The harbinger of his own death." Lyde didn't move. He knew there was no retreat. As they approached, Lyde felt a chill run through his body. He saw their leader, a tall figure with a pale face and lifeless eyes. The man held out his hand to Lyde. "Did you think you would avoid this? Did you think you could control fate?" "I've never controlled it," Lyde replied, clenching his fists. "And no one can." The leader smirked. "Fate will always find a way to catch up with us all. But you were the guide. Now you will reap the fruits of your curse." In that moment, Lyde realized the truth. His visions weren't just predicting death. They were shaping it. And now he was a prisoner of his own gift, forever trapped in a cycle of death he could not break. The darkness thickened.